Hello, this is Rabbi Dr. Juan Bejarano Gutierrez, and today we're going to start a series that's titled The Differences Between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. Now, I have to be quite honest, I have to keep these videos short because, as you know, I have many children. Not many, but I only have three, but they make quite a bit of noise. So just for the sake of sanity, I have to keep the videos short. But I think it's an interesting topic because sometimes people assume that they understand the fundamental differences that exist between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. They don't realize that sometimes subtle issues are often just as important as some of the more prominent elements that exist. First, I think we should define what we are actually talking about when we mention Sephardim and Ashkenazim. What I'm referring to is the medieval period. So we can use the terms Sephardim and Ashkenazim to refer to a number of different groups that are put under the category of each term, but more specifically in this particular case, I'm only looking at the Iberian Peninsula, so what we would call present-day Spain and Portugal, and then I'm looking at what we would call the Franco-German lands, northern France, Germany. I think you can include most of France for that matter, and we're calling this Ashkenaz, so we're not really talking about Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and the Iberian Peninsula, because the differences between the two, even though geographically they're not that distant, are quite different because of political differences that exist and a variety of other issues that are extremely important. So these are the two groups that we're talking about. Let's go ahead and jump into the next slide. The first thing that we should start off by saying is that the number of differences are simply too numerous to go into in a short video series, because that's really what we're shooting for. But the differences can be found at a social level, at an economic level, at a political level, at a geographic level, of course, and even at a religious and ethnic level, because the Jewish community in either place is absorbing individuals. Now, in the Iberian Peninsula, the Jewish communities were significantly larger than those that were found in Ashkenaz. Much, much larger. In fact, in the medieval period, the Jewish communities of present-day Spain and Portugal were the largest communities in Europe at the time. And you can really see that when you start to look at the number of communities and the numbers that we actually know, at least from tax records, at least the estimates that can be established based off those. But it's a very stark difference, and it's interesting because we see the ethnic influence, the language, the cultures, just the environment the environments are so different that they really do impact the nature of Jewish identity in both of these places. Now, that's not to say, of course, that there isn't commonality between Jews in Iberia and Jews in Ashkenaz. There's a shared history, there's the liturgy, there's the Talmud, there's the Tanakh. All these elements are part of the fabric of Jewish life, and even though there are differences, there's much that binds them together. Some scholars argue, and I think rightly so, that some of the differences are much more ancient, in the sense that there are differences in the Sephardic tradition that actually go back to the Babylonian communities, and that some of the Ashkenazic traditions are actually based in perspectives that are drawn from the land of Israel, perhaps from the Galilee. That's a little bit more in depth than we want to go into, but it's important to at least note that that's a possibility, and that's something that we should consider maybe in the future. What we want to look at, of course, is maybe a little bit more focused in on the medieval period again. And this is where we get into the political situation that is extremely important in shaping the framework and the worldview of these two communities. In 711, the Visigothic kingdom that had ruled the Iberian Peninsula, Spania, was conquered by invading Islamic forces from North Africa. Now, just for the sake of a little bit of history, we had the Western Roman Empire, and then we have the Visigothic kingdom that rises, and then we have the Islamic forces that invade. And the Jewish community in many ways benefits tremendously from this change in rule. Why? Because the Visigothic kingdom, after its conversion to Chalcedonian Christianity, because the Visigoths were originally Arians, they take a very negative view of Jews. There's a series of forced conversions. There's a series of forced exiles that have, in some cases, limited effect. But there's an attitude in the Visigothic kingdom as things progress that is very anti-Jewish. And the Islamic conquest is very favorably disposed toward Jews for very practical reasons, and that's simply the fact that Jews are not Christians, and Christians, of course, are the main enemy of Islam in the invading process. And so the natural ally for the North African forces are Jews. There's a linguistic similarity, of course. Arabic is a Semitic language. And there's just a sort of, I wouldn't say kinship, but there's obviously a connection there to Arabic culture, to North African culture that is very deep-seated. And so Jews and Arabs and Muslims from North Africa have this bond that is quite appropriate, as both of them are minorities in this Christian-dominated environment. And as a consequence, Jews in many ways become Arabized, as we'll see in the next page, and it makes a lot of sense. And Jews use their unique position linguistically and as this important minority to facilitate the spread of the Islamic conquest, because they're the natural place that the invading forces will look to sort of say, listen, this particular community is going to be more naturally aligned with us than the Christians that were, of course, persecuting them in previous years. In contrast to Ashkenaz, Jews are not the only ethnic religious group in the Iberian Peninsula. Of course, you have Muslims, you might have Berber tribesmen, Arabs, different groups from the different places in North Africa and the Near East. There are the Christian population, the old Christian population. But in Northern Europe and Central Europe, you have essentially Christians, obviously from different ethnic groups, but they're Christians, and you have Jews. And so the position of Jews in these areas is not as positive as it is going to be in the Iberian Peninsula, simply because of numbers and also because they are the minority of note. There may be heretical groups or something like that in the church that are a concern, but Jews in Ashkenaz hold a very different social, political ranking, if you will, than their compatriots in the Iberian Peninsula. And it's, of course, to the benefit of Jews in the Iberian Peninsula to have a much larger community, because they're not going to be simply the target. In fact, they're going to be allied, if you will, to a certain extent with the conquering Islamic authorities to their benefit. So that, I think, is extremely important. Now, Bernard Lewis, the historian, notes that there's a linguistic transformation that takes place. We can see this, I think, most importantly, if you're familiar with the Rambam, Moses ben Maimon, Rambam, Maimonides, who writes his Moreh Nevuchim, his Guide to the Perplexed, in Arabic. Of course, he writes in Hebrew, the Mishneh Torah, his introduction to the Mishnah, but it shows the extent to which Arabic plays a part. And you can just assume the Arabic culture, the influence of Islam, that becomes part of the process and meaning of Jewish life. Why? It's inevitable. It's like an American Jew living in the United States and assuming that somehow English and American culture don't impact American Jews and our thought process. And one of the things he says is that one of the major changes that took place in Jewish life in these countries was the process of Arabization, meaning primarily but not exclusively the replacement of the older languages by Arabic. It's extremely, extremely important that we consider this. It's just something that's critical. And he also refers to similarities between the two religious traditions. Both religious traditions have a legal tradition at their heart. You have halakha, you have sharia, you have teshuvot, which become very important in the medieval period, these halachic responsa, people writing to rabbis in different lands, maybe to the Gaonim in Babylonia, to the yeshivot, and they respond. And of course, in Islam, you have the fatwa, you have a response by an Islamic authority to pressing issues of a particular community. And then again, as I noted, we can see the influence on Jewish poetry, philosophy, and even theology, because of course, in the case of the Rambam and many others, I mean, whether it's Solomon ibn Gabirol or Dunash ben Labrat or any of the other individuals, poets and rabbis that existed at that time, it's inevitable for them not to be impacted by Arabic philosophy and the elements of the world that they lived in at that time. So these are very important things that happen. And I think in many ways the situation of Jews in Ashkenaz is much more limited. They're not undergoing this kind of renaissance, if you will, of classics, in Greek that are being translated into Arabic. They're not being translated into Latin or Romance languages that they have access to in the same way, certainly. They have other influences, I think, that are certainly prominent. You can argue from Christian sources, but the environment is very different simply because of the number of Jews that are present in the Iberian Peninsula. And we know this because of estimates that are drawn from tax records. So you can see the number of communities and families that live in the Iberian Peninsula based off of these tax records. Certainly in the later medieval period, the differences, I think, are quite striking or stark. Now, as I mentioned, Ashkenazim had the disadvantage of being the only notable minority in Christian lands, and as a consequence, they experienced a very different life in many ways. And it's not that we create this sort of lachrymose view of Jewish history, that it's only constant isolation or persecution, but the relationship with Christian society was very different. And obviously there were exceptions that existed. I always think about Rashi and his relationship with certain Christians in his city, in terms of those individuals, monks that wanted to study Hebrew. But in general, this life was very different in these places. If we look at the everyday life of Jews in the 11th century in France, for example, we can see the complicated relationships that existed, and we have an example, or at least an expoundation of that by Ezra Szejewski, who states the Jews of Troyes lived in harmony with their Christian neighbors. They hired Christian laborers under contract, their horses shod in workshops owned by Christians, their clothes laundered and repaired by Christian tailors. Jews borrowed money from Christians, which is sort of interesting because there's always that image of Christians being the ones borrowing from Jews, and the Christians in turn supplied Jews with their fresh fodder for their cattle on Jewish holidays, when Jews were not permitted to perform the chores entailed in fodder getting. So it's interesting, we have this image of these very different communities, and I think they were in the sense of comparison. If you look at the Iberian Peninsula, if you look at Ashkenaz, Central Europe, Northern France, and Germany, they are very different communities, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't a shared experience, at least at some level, with the non-Jewish community. I think it was, again, more beneficial to the average Jew in the Iberian Peninsula because you automatically had a more complex relationship, right? You had Jews, you had Muslims, which are the ruling power, and then you have this large body of Christians, and so Jews are not really the focal point in that sense of the Islamic authorities. They're more concerned about the welfare of the state because of the fact that they're outnumbered by the dominant Christian population in terms of demographics. So it's something interesting to keep in mind. So we're going to stop there with this first video. I hope that's interesting to you. We'll start looking at some practical examples as we move forward in subsequent videos, and we'll just expand on that, and hopefully we'll get some questions and comments from individuals that are watching.